Welcome to the Shenandoah County Library's 2024 Black History Month program. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for tonight's special program as we talk about the unique role African Americans play in our community's history here in Shenandoah County. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a group of African American performers from Woodstock, Virginia in 1921 who played a very important but also a brief role um, in that community's local history. So if you'll bear with me for one moment, I will share my screen over and we will get the presentation started. So tonight's program is entitled Virginia Minstrels, Woodstock's 1921 African American Performers. This program really started with a photograph that we uncovered several years ago when we received a donation um, of local history materials. This is the photograph. It lives in what is called the George W. Smith collection here at the library, which is a large collection of photographs from in and around the Woodstock area. Snapshots, but also some professional photographs produced by Morrison Studios, like this one. In this picture, there are 16 African Americans who are obviously posing for a photograph related to some type of performance. You can see musicians, people in various costumes. And when this came to us, there was really only one identification, which was the gentleman on the left was identified as Preston Scott. Um, However, no additional information was known about this photograph, including the date or the reason it was taken. So a few months ago, while working on what we hoped was going to be a Black History Month program that would talk about some of the photographs we have identified of local African Americans in our community, I found this newspaper article. This talks about a performance that was being prepared by the members of Mount Zion Methodist Church in Woodstock, Virginia, which is the historically Black congregation located on Church Street. Um, the performance was being prepared in order to help the church raise money for a new building that they were constructing to replace their original church building, which at that point was about 60 years old and in a state of disrepair. This performance was called, according to the newspaper, the Virginia Minstrels, and would be held on February 24th, 1921, at the New Theater in Woodstock, Virginia. You can see there what the performance featured. And when we reviewed this newspaper article, we actually were able to determine that it was referring to the group of individuals pictured in the photograph that we had from the George W. Smith collection. How were we able to do this? Um, Really through a process of deduction and some decent detective work. So the first one was since we knew that Preston Scott appeared in this photograph, you can see that his name also appears in this newspaper article as a character named Snowball. So that's one piece of evidence that indicate that this possibly could be that photograph of the group. The second piece was, as we examined it, you can see that some of the characters in the photograph, their makeup and costume match the characters listed in the newspaper article. So, for example, this character matches up with this character Bones um, by the fact that he has like a skeleton type um, makeup on. We also were able to determine through some other detective work the identities of some of the other individuals in this photograph as we started to work through the possibility that this could be from the newspaper article. And we'll talk about who they are later, but as we determined who else was in this photograph, provided more and more evidence indicating that this photograph was indeed the Virginia Minstrels. And finally, to rule out any other options, um, we knew this photograph had to occur during the first half of the 1920s. Um, so we did some additional digging and were unable to find any other African American performance groups from Woodstock or reported in the Shenandoah Herald during that period. So through that process of elimination, we have determined that this photograph from the George W. Smith collection does show the Virginia Minstrels. And when we determined that, it became relatively easy to make the decision that this should be the theme of our 2024 Black History Month program. And hopefully, we would be able to use it to learn something about our local community and what it can tell us in 2024. So starting out, we took a look at what exactly was the show that this performance group was involved with. So the first thing was, what exactly is a minstrel show? So a minstrel show is defined by Encyclopedia Britannica as an American theatrical form popular from the early 19th to early 20th century that was founded on the comic enactment of racial stereotypes. So a minstrel show is basically some type of performance that focuses on what was commonly believed and the stereotypes developed around African Americans in this country. Um, and it featured several things, including often blackface, these certain set of characters, including a Mr. Tambo and Mr. Bones, um, a person in formal attire, who would then engage with them with jokes and ballads and comedy and other things, followed up by a second act, usually of individuals with specific performances. One of the earliest versions of the Minstrels was the Virginia Minstrels. Um, it was a basically what we would consider a traveling show um, that featured individuals in blackface. Uh, Early on, sometimes African Americans, but especially white performers, and then later on, almost exclusively white performers. Um, and by the early 20th century, the kind of professionalism or professional shows that use blackface had given away to amateur performances that where local groups would be able to take pre-printed minstrel show programs and performances and use them as fundraisers in their community. So all types of local groups like Rotary clubs and Lions clubs and all types of other organizations put on these performances of really racial stereotypes in order to try to get a laugh and provide some entertainment and um, raise some funds. So, with that understanding of what is a minstrel show and kind of the um, really racist um, form that that comes from, we took a closer look at this photograph and to try to determine what was really happening here and who was in this performance. So we were able to determine six different identities of the performers just based on what their outfits and costumes that they were using. So, number one in the middle, we think this is the interlocutor who was which is the title for the guy in formal wear who would be kind of the center of the show, the MC or um, whatever you would want to call it. We believe this is the person in the middle because his wear is much more formal than the other individuals pictured here. Number two, we have the character Snowball, who was outlined in the newspaper article. Three, we have the character Bones, who is one of the other main characters outlined. The three individuals with a number four on them um, are what were called in-men. So in-men were individuals who would participate in the dialogue between the main characters during the first half of the show and provide the jokes and kind of the running commentary. Um, the newspaper article from 1921 only lists four individuals, um, but there are five people here in some type of blackface or some type of costume. So we're unsure who is who apart from the two that we were able to identify based on who they were or specifically what type of makeup that they were wearing. We also have three female performers who um, are noted with the number five in this photograph. These three female performers are actually kind of rare because female performers in minstrel shows, especially during the time period that this photograph was taken, would have been rarer than male performers. So it is really unique, but we don't know exactly what they did in the performance. And then we have members of the band posing with their instruments. And they're all marked with the number six, and they would have been responsible for the music of the show, um, both during the first and the second act. So this show was held in February 1921, and these two articles appear on the March 4th, 1921 Shenandoah Herald edition, reporting on the show that had been held at the new theater on the left, um, talking about the fact that the performance group, which we have photographed, had developed an excellent reputation and were very popular in the Woodstock community, having standing room only, and then had to do a unplanned repeat performance um, at the theater. So apparently, while we don't know exactly what performance that they were conducting, apparently was fairly popular. So popular, in fact, that the newspaper reported that a second performance would happen at the Calvary Graded School, which is just west of Woodstock, Virginia, on March 8th, featuring these individuals. So, once again, not only was it popular enough to have two performances in Woodstock, they actually took the show on the road. These are the last two newspaper articles we find about this performance. So we assume that it was probably not held much longer after the March 8th one at the Calvary Graded School. But we do know it appears to have been fairly popular because later that year, Mount Zion Methodist Church was able to open their new church building, and it reportedly raised over $1,000 through fundraisers, which this was probably the main one, or approximately $16,000 in today's money. So it appears to have been fairly successful, especially considering admission was 25 cents a piece. So apart from the show itself, this picture and kind of gives us an introduction into the actors that we've been able to identify. So the first one was Preston Scott Sr. Preston was the one whose identity this photograph came with. You can see him in the center in the left on a later picture from the 1950s. Um, Preston was born in Virginia in 1886 and lived in Shenandoah County his entire life, dying in 1975. He did a lot of things. Typically, in the census, he's listed as either a laborer or a janitor for different companies. But we also know that at various points he ran some restaurants. He ran a food stand at the fair that was very popular. He was a church elder for several different churches in Shenandoah County and was very involved in his community. The next person that we have identified in this photograph is William H. Polk, who was actually the minister of Mount Zion Methodist Church during the time that the photograph was taken. You can see another Morrison photograph of him on the left. He was actually born and raised in Philadelphia and was trained as a Methodist minister. He came to West Virginia in 1917 for his first church, and then we believe Shenandoah County's local African American churches were his second. He ministered at Mount Zion in Strasburg, Mount Zion in Woodstock, and the African American Methodist churches in Mount Jackson and Newmarket as well. He lived here with his wife and his mother, who had been widowed and was living here with them. His wife, Edna, was a native of Newmarket, and he had married her after coming here. And they had their first son while living in Shenandoah County in 1922. This photograph was on the left was taken probably around the time that his son was born. As the minister, William Polk was responsible for really leading the congregation's efforts to raise the funding for the new church. We actually think that the plan to build the new church existed by the time he arrived here. But he really was responsible for making sure that all of the events and fundraising efforts went off without a hitch. He also taught at the segregated school in Woodstock and actually wrote a column in the Shenandoah Herald for the local African American community. So he really took a strong leadership role in helping the church raise the money that they needed. And he served here until around 1925 when he went off to serve at some other churches. Next in this photograph, we were able to identify Lewis McAfee. Lewis McAfee was from Woodstock, and his father was originally a barber until he died when Lewis was younger. So around the time this photograph is taken, Lewis is working as a laborer, helping to support his widowed mother, and his siblings. He eventually marries in 1926. They stay in this area for a little while he's working as a cook. But then they move, eventually, he and his wife move to Washington, D.C., where he was the head janitor for an apartment building where he lived. Um, and he would stay in D.C. until his death and is buried in Woodstock. Lewis's wife is actually also pictured in this photograph. This is before they were married, but her name, Elsie Pye, um, she's circled here with her head turned to the left. Um, she was born in DC, but comes back to Woodstock in 1920 when she is 10 years old um, to live with her family. She married Lewis in 1926 um, and supported him in his work as a janitor. Um, Eventually, when they moved to DC, and she stayed there after his death and would eventually die there. A couple other individuals that we've been able to find in this photograph is this woman whose name we don't know, but her presence is unique in the fact that we have found two other images from the Morrison Studio collection that show her in the same costume that she's wearing in this photograph. So that means that most likely they were produced as part of a photo shoot to promote the show. So probably at the same time that Morrison took this group photo, he would have taken other photographs showing individuals in their costumes as they were trying to promote not only the show, but also their performance in something that was relatively popular. The last person that we've been able to identify or learn more about in this image is this guy, Charles E. Butcher, who lived from 1890 to 1961. In 1920, right before this photograph was taken, um, he was a laborer in a creamery in Woodstock. Um, he was also a World War One veteran um, and would eventually marry his wife Annabelle Butcher, who was from Maryland, where he would move and live out his days until 1961. So, what is the legacy of this photograph? So, this photograph has really given us the opportunity to really investigate more about the history of the local African American community in Woodstock, to learn, number one, about the popular show that they were able to perform, um, and how connected that was with the community, and how the support of the rest of the community for the church building really plays out. It also has helped us learn um, how much work the church community had to do in order to afford the new structure that they were building, um, and how all of these individuals really took a leading role in trying to build the church as an organization and a structure in Woodstock. So while we still don't know exactly the date of this photograph, or really the whole story behind it, we have been able to uncover a lot more than we previously knew. But of course, it does bring forth a lot of new questions, like how did these individuals feel about performing in a minstrel show with the racial undertones associated with it? Um, how did um, they use the show to really build um, relationships with in a segregated community that was Woodstock in 1921? Um, and how did it really help define uh, who they were as a community during that time period? To have such a popular show um, that apparently seems to have garnered at least enough support to produce not only three shows, but a series of photographs showcasing all the individuals involved in it. So I'd like to thank everyone. Like to thank everyone for attending tonight's Black History Month program and for taking the time out of their schedule to learn a little bit more about um, the community that we all live in. I would encourage you, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or you can stop by the archives at the Shenandoah County Library here in Edinburgh. Hope you have a wonderful night, and we will hopefully see you soon.